and welcome to Masking for It, the podcast with a purpose, combining clinical insight with lived experience. Join us as we explore the realities of high-masking neurodivergent adults, debunk myths around autism and ADHD, and challenge outdated and harmful systems as we discuss the ways we can help neurodivergent people not just survive, but thrive. We're here so that the hidden can feel seen, the confused can find clarity, and the future can be different, because it needs to be. You can help us massively by following or subscribing, and in return, we can continue to bring you along behind the scenes with expert guests, pioneering research, and the chance to say you were a part of the change that we're creating. So, let's do this. Hello, we are having a really interesting start today, and I've just had technology wars. Gail, how are you doing?
I'm still living on a high after meeting Bionic at the weekend at the Gladiator show.
Even though you didn't know who he was.
Yeah, well, we'll breeze over that bit. How are you, Lesley?
I'm okay, thank you. Yeah, busy day. Lots of different people today, and a lot of stress. Not for me, but for them. So yeah, the world is a stressful place, isn't it?
Yeah, it is at the moment.
Especially leading up to Christmas as well. It's brewing, isn't it? Even though we're not even in December yet.
Yeah, I saw something online today that was like, now's the time of year to swap your general anxiety to your special Christmas-based anxiety.
That's it, I like that. Yeah, I don't like the anxiety, but I like the idea of it.
Yeah, does take a new form, doesn't it, I think?
Yeah. How about you, Alexandra? How are you?
I'm okay. I did feel rather festive last week. I went to York for the Christmas markets, which was lovely. But I got a cold the day we drove down. That did not hinder my shopping. But yeah, I think I'm just sort of recovering, whilst also thinking, oh my gosh, there is so much to do. Exactly that festive anxiety. And yeah, just quite overwhelmed. I'm excited and I'm looking forward to everything, but we're going away over Christmas, so I feel like I've got to get Christmas done so much earlier and then go and do it again. Just trying to buy everything and see everyone all at once.
Oh yeah, I've got you going away, so that's was a lot earlier for you.
Yes, yeah, but it's made me be more organised than I usually would be. Definitely never organised like this, so maybe it's a good thing, but I am just wiped out by it.
Yeah, there's a lot of people talking about wiped out in general, just because of the time of year and the weather as well, and it being dark. People struggle with that, don't they, as well?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I love the dark early nights and being cozy, but I think maybe my biological clock's starting to suffer and taking it a bit harder energy-wise, but mood-wise, I'm still like, no, there's Christmas ads on, Christmas films, it's going to be okay. I just want to go to sleep.
Yeah, I know what you mean about that. I think about 3:30 it starts to go really dark. And it's like, oh, is it bedtime? I think my brain thinks it's bedtime for about 5 hours before it actually is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hibernation time.
Well, we can't go yet because we're carrying on a little bit from last time, aren't we? Speaking about that post-diagnosis sort of phase and how that can feel and what things can help in that time. And therapy was one of those that can be helpful for some people. And I know we covered a little bit of some things that are helpful with therapy, some things that might not be so much. And that led us to wanting to speak today in a bit more detail about how that can differ for neurodivergent people. And some people call it neuroaffirming therapy, because there are some really subtle differences with what we need, what is helpful, what isn't helpful, and why. So for both neurodivergent people and therapists who want to be helping neurodivergent people as well as they can, Lesley and Gail are going to take us through all of those things that they do in a little bit more detail and give us all some more understanding, because it can be quite complex, can't it?
Yeah, I think people's therapy journey, if they're neurodivergent, can be really negative. So I think the idea of therapy for a lot of people who've already been in therapy and found it wasn't quite for them, it's just another tick on the box of, well, you're not very good at school, you're not very good at this, you're not very good at therapy either. And that message of failure that is so wrong, because it's actually the other way around. School isn't for neurodivergent people sometimes, and neither are bog standard therapies. And I think the problem we've got really is that in the NHS provides therapy for free for people, so that's not a problem. But I think the problem is it tends to be CBT, and that's not always the therapy that I would go for, because the whole point of CBT is to challenge beliefs and to challenge assumptions about the world. And some neurodivergent people have assumptions that are absolutely true. And as much as you challenge them, I think the example you gave, Alexandra, was going somewhere like a massive shopping centre. You might have social anxiety and be able to challenge that, but you can't challenge the fact that somewhere really crowded, really noisy, really bright, lots of people pushing into you. You can't challenge the fact that that might be a distressing place to be for someone who's neurodivergent. And so for that reason, therapies that challenge beliefs may not always be that helpful. And I think it's really important for neurodivergent people, especially just after they've been diagnosed, if they're told there's nothing wrong with you, but could you just fix the way that you think about the world, is a really unhelpful message, because people don't need fixing. It's about learning to regulate. And I think there's a really big difference between those two things.
Yeah, I think from my perspective as a speech and language therapist as well, that those kind of talking therapies are so dependent on somebody being able to use language to convey what they're feeling and what they're experiencing to somebody in a way that the other person understands the intensity of that experience. And we know that autistic people can struggle to identify their internal sensations, their internal bodily state. So being able to identify and then give a name to an emotion and also convey the intensity of that emotion to somebody can be a massive challenge for somebody, and kind of arrive back at that double empathy problem, that the issue arises that the neurotypical therapist doesn't understand the neurodivergent emotional experience, and therefore the therapy can't progress because there's that fundamental communication breakdown happening. And feel like, and we're often encountering a speech and language therapist, or kind of, can you support this person to verbalize their emotion? And it's like, well, actually that might not be an effective way for them to communicate those internal sensations, and there's perhaps other ways that are better, perhaps them learning themselves, but other people around them learning the kind of signs and signals of different emotional states, and helpful responses to that is perhaps a much more useful way to go than spending time looking at people's faces and saying what emotion they're experiencing without any other contextual cues.
Yeah, and I think people often come to see me and say, well, I've had therapy, but actually during the whole time I was masking and I just did what was expected. So I kind of passed and I was felt to have improved, but that therapy was actually not that helpful for me. And I suppose it's about reframing what therapy is, because I think it's really important that people don't feel they need therapy after a diagnosis. It's not something that is necessary all of the time. For some people, being seen and recognising your neurotype is enough in itself for people to go away and do their own research. And I think you said the other day, what a puffing deep dive into something. I suppose the idea that you need therapy to feel better doesn't mean that you have to think differently necessarily. It's just about an exploration of who you are. So for some people who might say to me, well, I'd like some sessions following diagnosis, it could be quite simply sitting and talking about, well, who actually am I? Who do I see myself as? How do other people see me? What even is my identity? Because I've been so many different versions of myself throughout school or college or different jobs or uni, and I feel like people see me negatively, and actually I don't even know who I am anymore. So I think identity is a really key part of working through something. You know, for some people that's about reading or watching videos by people who are neurodivergent, or it could be talking to other neurodivergent people, or it could just be a sense of writing a diary, or, you know, documenting your own thoughts and ideas. It doesn't necessarily need a therapist to be able to do some of those things. So I think it's really important to get that across, that therapy is not necessarily required all the time. I do myself out of a job here, but I think it's really important that people don't need to be fixed, but they might find a safe space to explore lots of ideas. And I think the thing that people very often say is, I can't do therapy because I tried it and it doesn't work for me. And I think maybe it's just that's the issue, is that the type of therapy hasn't been quite right, or the focus of therapy has been about challenging or fixing, when actually there's a lot of therapies out there that are so very, very different.
I think kind of from understanding your identity, then you're much better able to articulate what it is that you find challenging. And I know I've done a lot of work and worked with colleagues that have done a lot of work on helping people to build their communication profile. So what is it that I can do? What is it that other people can do to support with understanding, or support you to express yourself most effectively? How can we work together to make communication work? But if you're not in a place where you understand that for yourself, then that's really hard to articulate to other people. And without that knowledge, you can't then advocate for yourself. And I think we can be we can kind of say quite flippantly, oh, you know, encouraging people to self-advocate, but there's all those skills around being able to self-advocate that we need to support people to do. And we often think about perhaps developing scripts and helping people to think about ways that they could say no to something, or ways that they can get themselves out of a sticky situation, or ways to buy a bit of time to think about something. And what language can you use that almost that is there as a pre-program that you can pull on when you need it? So there's some of those just little kind of communication strategies, but you have to have that basis of identity and self-understanding to be able to then advocate for those and to feel able to use them, I suppose.
I think one of the things that, when thinking about communication, that's a real challenge is that, in particular for autistic people, what neurotypical people might do non-verbally when they're expressing distress might look very, very different from somebody who's also very high masking autistic. So you might see people who are used to pleasing and fawning and smiling talking about some really, really difficult subjects verbally, but non-verbally not showing that on the outside. And it's really important for therapists to not make assumptions about what that means, because I think it can sometimes come across as if people are deliberately being disingenuous, or, you know, not really taking something seriously, or not as affected by what they're saying because maybe the facial expression doesn't match the level of distress that they're talking about. So I think that's really important for therapists to be aware of. You can't really always judge the severity or the depth of someone's emotion just by how they come across. And I think that applies across the board as well. For example, in school, people seem to be fine, that magic word. They're fine in school because they look okay. But actually, I think a lot of high masking autistic people are very good at doing that. because they've had to learn to do it. And I guess that was something that perhaps you've talked about, Alexandra.
Yeah, certainly the high masking part can really trip people up, because when I think of it sort of from the outside in, I realise lots of people don't assume that autistic people can be sarcastic. Autistic people use humour a lot. So there's this awful misconception that we don't really understand humour, we don't get sarcasm. But actually, they're probably things I use really often. And the more emotional or dark something feels to me, the more likely I am to, you know, I do have very dark humour. But I think, you know, it's a mechanism for making it palatable for other people and not being too much of a burden, because, you know, I learned very early on, when I am my full emotional self, which is incredibly emotional, I feel everything, although it's through a magnifying glass. So to make that acceptable socially, I've had to mask that. I've had to suppress that. And I didn't really learn to until much later on. I think there was a long time, especially into my teens, it was just, well, this is me, this is where I am. And it just was so problematic to other people and therefore to me. So yeah, absolutely end up deflecting, using humour and things that aren't associated with us. And I think that's where it's difficult as well, because prior to my diagnosis, sitting with some therapists I have and thinking about being told about the CBT triangle of thoughts and behaviours, and what is it? Thoughts, behaviours,
feelings,
and how they drive each other. I even said to her, I said, that's what my brain does every day, all day, every day. It thinks about different scenarios, it thinks about different things, and it goes round loops like that of thinking, oh, this happened, and why did that happen? And well, I felt like this about it. And actually, I'm incredibly self-aware, and, you know, do have lots of words for my feelings. But what I didn't have before my diagnosis was a why. So I knew what was going on. I knew I wasn't okay. And everyone was telling me, well, if you work this out, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, I've already done that, but okay, I'll try, because I'm so desperate to feel better. And as you say, Lesley, people please and do as I'm told and complete this and not fail at another thing. And I want to get it right and appease somebody. But meanwhile, you stagger out and you just think, why am I sitting for hours with somebody every week to go around in a loop and absolutely nothing changes? And I think it's only once you have your diagnosis and realise, oh, it's those things aren't going to stop affecting me. I'm not going to stop feeling drained just because I've recognised it, because I do recognise it all. The diagnosis gives me the why, and then what I needed help with, and you both did with me, was the processing of that and the sort of educating about what this means for me and working all of those things out, but also coming up with sort of strategies, or even just talking things through and feeling reassured about, that's why you struggle with this, that's why this feels harder, or that's why that drains you more, or this means you're overwhelmed. And just starting to learn those different things, that has been the most helpful part to me, because it's not an issue with identifying these things for me. It's been, okay, how can I help myself when I'm in that state, or when I'm struggling with this, or when I'm in this situation? And then you get to practice those things, and then you can do some of those things better, because half of it's feeling reassured. At least you know what's going on and why, and that makes some things completely disappear, because you're like, oh God, well, yeah, no, I know I'm fine. Or say I struggle with temperature regulation, I'm always boiling. So when I'm doing the shops and stuff, I can take all of the sounds, people, everything to a certain extent, but the second I overheat, I've got to take a time out and cool down, because then I get really angry, then I get really stressed. And, you know, I think that's an example of when you know what you're dealing with, you can do something about it. But as long as you're sitting there going around in circles, not finding out what it is, but being told that thinking about it as much as you already do is going to solve it, that's really distressing and a dead end. And we can't keep doing that. That's not helping anybody.
Yeah. And I think that really links nicely to energy accounting, that I think we'll probably come back to in another episode. But I think very briefly, the idea that if you think about your energy and what you spend your energy on as a human, in the same way as you might deal with your mobile phone and plug it in when it's depleted, we have to do that as neurodivergent people and recognise when something is too much, or when you might need to leave and reset, or when you might need to say, I need to go now, or actually, no, I can't make that. And I suppose that, you know, the people pleasing gets in the way of that, because you might say yes to loads of things and then just be completely overwhelmed because you've not had time to recharge, or giving yourself permission during the week to say, well, do you know what, I've got that on Monday, so maybe, you know, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'll take it a little bit easier in the evening and recharge doing whatever it is that I need to do. So for some people, it's going to the gym and sport and swimming. For some people, it's getting cozy and doing nothing and maybe watching the favourite film over and over again, or getting stuck into a box set. But I suppose it's recognising that energy accounting is really key. And I think one of the reasons why neurodivergent people get diagnosed with depression so frequently is that they get to a point where they've got no energy for long periods of time and completely burn out. And you see it a lot in school refusal, or a lot in people who are in inpatient wards. I think there's a lot of people who are misdiagnosed with depression when actually they've just got no energy left, and they've not got an understanding of their own needs within that context. But I think the other thing that people get misdiagnosed with a lot is personality disorder. And I think there's something about people perhaps presenting in different ways, or people look like them, you know, as we were just saying, and their outward appearance doesn't maybe match what they're saying, or they might seem a little bit at odds with what they said last week, or become a different version of themselves each time they come to therapy. And the therapist might be really confused about, well, there's not a sense of self that is really kind of consistent, or that people might start to do really, really what might be called challenging things for the therapist, but might not turn up, or they might say something that's not quite true because they want to please the therapist, and then all kinds of misinterpretations happen where people start to be seen as a little bit personality disordered and end up in, you know, people end up in inpatient wards with these labels. And my view, having worked for so long with neurodivergent people, is that a lot of people are neurodivergent and have experienced some trauma and then end up with that label. And so it's so easy to get misdiagnosed, and it makes sense why people get misdiagnosed, because of all these misunderstandings about what's going on. And I think it's really important to think about, when for therapists who get a client or a patient who comes with a label of personality disorder, particularly borderline personality disorder, or depression, or anxiety, or manic depression as it used to be called, bipolar disorder, to think about unpicking actually what is going on there, because very often it's neurodivergence.
Bipolar or borderline personality disorder were the two things I'd come across that resembled slightly my experience, but then also didn't feel quite right. The bipolar, there was just something. I wasn't extreme enough. There weren't extremes enough. There were those swings and different features. And then borderline personality disorder did tick a lot of boxes. And correct me if I'm wrong, with the borderline personality disorder and personality disorders generally, they sort of stem from some attachment issues, or can do. And is that also where there can be some confusion with, neurodivergence? Because actually we can see trauma a lot in neurodivergent people. We can see there have been attachment issues because the rest of the family is probably neurodivergent, and that can stem from that. It's a very complex thing for you to untangle, but there must be some telltale differences there as well.
I think the thing with the question is, how do you tell apart trauma and neurodivergence, is very often they're so intertwined that it's so common to have some kind of traumatic experiences as a neurodivergent person. I think people talk about school trauma, people talk about relationship traumas, and maybe being in relationships that are abusive or where people have been vulnerable in certain situations. And I think, in a way, if you think about all the Epstein stuff that's going on in the news at the moment, and how he was actively seeking out people who were vulnerable and lost. There's a lot of abusers who are actively seeking out vulnerable young people, many of whom will be neurodivergent. And I was reading an article actually about Virginia Giuffre the other day, and the idea that actually she was possibly neurodivergent, but no one ever really unpicked that with her at the time. I think, well, she'd been through so much trauma in her lifetime. Where do you even begin to unpick? But I think a good assumption is that they're both together, that it's happening together. Well, I suppose if you think about therapy, the idea that you need to get better at socialising with someone, or you need to get better at being more neurotypical, is very often, traditional therapies would be looking at that idea that someone needs to be less socially anxious, or from a speech and language therapy point of view, better at communicating. And the bottom line is, what they mean is looking more neurotypical. And I think one of the things that's really become much more prominent over recent years is that it's okay to be neurodivergent. You don't have to be anybody different, and it's okay to have the strengths and skill set that comes with your neurodivergence and celebrate it, even though you might have been told off for aspects of it. It's about recognising, going back to identity again, around who am I, but also recognising that life is dysregulating because it's not set up for neurodivergent people. And learning to energy account is one way of managing that, but also thinking about how to regulate is really key. And very often the sensory aspects of the world is really, really important for that. And I think one of the lesser known therapies is occupational therapy. And obviously we've not got any OTs on our pod, but I think it might be helpful for us to invite someone on to talk about sensory processing differences in neurodivergent people, and what that might look or feel like, and some ways that perhaps you can use lots of other sensory seeking behaviours like deep pressure and proprioception, that movement, to help to regulate. And I think that would be perhaps something we can do a little bit of a dive in to in another.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think it's been a massive eye opener for me, kind of working closely with OTs over the years and kind of listening to people's sensory experience, that, kind of traditionally we think of calming as sitting still and doing deep breathing and maybe meditating or mindfulness. And yes, that works for some people, doesn't it? But actually the calming that you can experience through deep pressure and movement, and it is kind of on a whole different level, I think, and kind of giving people permission, or even just explaining why going for long runs or swimming or whatever it is that somebody does that gives them that deep pressure and movement, why they've sought that out over the years, and why that's actually helpful for them, and what other ways they can use that input to help with that energy accounting and regulation across the day and across the week. I think is just key for people, isn't it?
I started having some massage therapy every couple of weeks, and the difference that is making, just having that time where I think it is hard for lots of us to do the quiet things like meditate, or I tried Tai Chi and it was mind numbing. I couldn't go that slowly. I couldn't slow myself down that much. But having a massage, it's that pressure, and that release of all the tension that I have all of the time because I'm so tense. But then she's actually done something really different and interesting, and it's to do with your vagus nerve and calming down your nervous system. And in part of the massage, she actually goes really slowly, and it completely trips my brain and makes it so still. And I've never experienced that before. So definitely there are so many different things you can try, and it's got to be the one for you. And I think the main point I'd make is it's absolutely a case of finding what regulates you, and the more regulated I am, the more I feel better in myself, and I can perform. And I still do cling to my mask sometimes. I do still want to be masked. It's therapy isn't all about unmasking. I think it's obviously healthy to unmask to a certain extent, and there's some unmasking that happens that you don't have control over, and that can feel quite distressing at the start. But I think as long as you have treatments or therapies that can help you feel well and recharge, that is the most important thing to helping you perform as much or as little as you want to. But that is what sort of helps you function and heal.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I often find myself saying, like, anybody, neurotypical or not, has experienced difficulty when you're stressed or when you're anxious. You don't communicate as well as when you're regulated and calm, and so that's got to be the foundation for people, isn't it? To be the best and to communicate the best that you can and in the most effective way that you can. You've got to be experiencing regulation, and that comes from knowing what you can do yourself and knowing how the environment needs to be and other people need to be to enable you to feel regulated and to be able to access that and advocate for that for yourself.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that links with that is about executive function and that organisation bit of your brain that helps you to kind of have a sense of, that metacognitive awareness, being able to step back and have a bit of an overview of what's going on for you, and to think about how your emotions might connect with what's happened. All of those things are those are processes that your executive function would be able to help you with. So the analogy I very often use is the idea that every orchestra has a conductor and helps the orchestra to manage as a whole and work together as a whole to know when to slow down and to speed up, or when to go louder or quieter, when to start and when to stop. And I think for people who struggle with executive function, the conductor, life can be really stressful, and obviously that can be very dysregulating if you've forgotten something, if you're constantly losing things, you forget what time your appointment is, or you're always in a rush. But I think that can be really misconstrued in therapy too. So if people are late, for example, or people overrun because they're not really aware of how much time has passed, or might find it hard to transition in and out of the building, and maybe sit in the car and just struggle to get up and shift from one state to another, or perhaps even thinking about those therapies that require people to do homework, and people finding that overwhelming. I think it's really, really important to have that as a key awareness in therapy of how somebody might come across as if they're not bothered, or might be a little bit disinterested because they've not got everything they needed, or they said they were going to talk about something this time but they've forgotten to prepare. That can be really misunderstood as kind of disinterest, when actually it's just someone's executive function. I think that's pretty much across the board. Anyone who's neurodivergent has something going on with the conductor of the brain somehow. And I think it's about finding strategies to support that, externally. So it might be timers, reminders, post-its, technology. You do so much on your phone now to help your executive function. And, it doesn't stand out as being odd if you're sitting looking at your phone on the bus. So I think some of it's about real practical strategies as well. And that can be part of therapy, thinking about, what can I do to help me remember to do this because it stresses me out every week, or this is a particular hotspot in my day that I really struggle with.
So anybody listening who would like to think about getting some sort of therapy and doesn't know where to start, and their doctors just, suggested the usual, but actually they want to find something that is likely to understand them and help them with strategies like that, where are we signposting them to? What sort of therapies and words are we looking out for?
Well, I think one of the key things is to think perhaps about relational therapies rather than thinking about fixing beliefs. So there's a brilliant therapy that I sometimes use, which is called cat therapy. You can bring your cat if you want, I imagine, but it's not really about cats. It stands for cognitive analytic therapy, and that helps us to unpick different relational patterns that we build with people. So masking, for example, pleasing, fawning, judging, rejecting, all of the different roles we find ourselves in, or on the receiving end of, or being accused of doing to other people. Relational therapy is a really helpful way to map that out. And it's not necessarily about fixing it, it's about noticing what patterns you get into and thinking about what exits you might find from that pattern, or that series of places that you might go to. And it's very visual, and you draw out a map collaboratively with your therapist to think about the things that you do and say in your relationships, and how things can get stuck or might be a bit tricky. So I think relational therapies are brilliant, and also compassion-based therapies are also really helpful. So the idea that you might use self-compassion and think about why you've ended up in a particular situation. So if somebody, for example, ends up in addiction services or has an addiction, it might be recognising that at some point in your life, that addiction started off as being a helpful thing you did to manage a difficulty, and using the compassion-based therapy to look at, well, yeah, it's not helpful now for various reasons around health or finances or relationships, but at the time it was helpful. And to think about, well, what actually was the difficulty in the first place, and what else might you do to support that, rather than just stop being addicted. It's about self-compassion. So I think any compassion-based therapies are really, really important. But I think the key thing is to find a therapist who either is neurodivergent or is, what was the word we called it before? Neuroaffirming. Yeah, which I think it can be difficult to know whether that's the case. But I suppose when we're trying out therapists, we do a little bit of browsing, don't we? And we look at people's backgrounds and think about, well, I'll look this person up, I'll see where they've been before I open my brain and reveal myself. So I think it's really important to check out that someone is aware of neurodivergence. I think that's a really key thing to look up.
Yeah, I think when you kind of look at people's profiles, and often on kind of websites where you can search for therapists, there's kind of often a list of conditions or things that people have got the expertise to work with. And I guess I'm always slightly suspicious of therapists that work with a massive range of conditions and also say that they can work with neurodivergent people, because I feel like, because the approach needs to be different, I feel like you do need to have some of that specialist knowledge and skill, and the people that tend to have that knowledge and skill that's what their main focus is, and that they don't tend to work with a broad range of things. So I think I would always look for, if I was, if somebody was asking me for advice, I would always suggest, well, look at somebody who that is their specialism, or that is their main focus. And like Lesley says, it focuses on those types of therapy that we know are helpful for neurodivergent people, and perhaps don't focus on things like CBT that we know are unhelpful for the reasons that we've discussed.
Fantastic. And any therapists wanting to tailor themselves more, learn more about how they can help neurodivergent people, where would you direct them to?
I think one of the key things is perhaps to recognise that if someone's stuck, if someone's struggling to put into place what you've been talking about in therapy, to consider that the person might be neurodivergent is not an offensive thing to think. It is okay to say, to maybe raise it. So if someone says, well, do you know what, I'm always late, or I've had a series of friends and I just don't know what it is about me, but I can't seem to maintain relationships for long, or I'm really blunt and I offend people, I've been accused of being rude. I think whatever somebody brings to you in therapy, then you don't have to necessarily say anything other than what they've said to you, and to reflect it back and to say, well, you mentioned that this might be a difficulty. Have you ever thought you might be neurodivergent, or do you think, do you feel that you might be different from most people? And I think if you are working with somebody, it's not offensive to say that. It's not, I think we go back to that issue of stigma that we talked about a few weeks ago, that I think people think it's offensive to suggest that someone might be autistic. Right? I think it's a compliment. Very often people who are autistic have so much integrity that is off the scale. That's perhaps why people get in a pickle sometimes, because not everybody else does. But I suppose it's important to seek supervision from a neuroaffirming therapist. So all therapists are supposed to have supervision with someone to check out their own responses, to check out how they're responding to the clients, and to think about their own issues and whether they're, maybe putting something onto a client that's actually them. So I would seek out neuroaffirming supervision if you're not a therapist that's used to working with neurodivergent people.
Yeah, and certainly within speech therapy, and I'm sure it's the same within psychology, there's a lot of networks now of people with that particular interest or specialism, and there's, they share information about trainings and advertising supervision availability and things like that. So kind of using the networks within the profession can be really helpful for therapists that want to know more.
There's a lot of special interest groups out there, which are now really accessible because everyone's online, aren't they? Because you can join online. There's a lot of therapy special interest group. There's a CAT Neurodivergent special interest group. There are going to be groups of people who are wanting to come together and share ideas, and I think it's quite easy to find that kind of network within your own professional area if you look for it.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much for sharing those insights. That's really, really interesting to hear, especially, there are some things I still, you're not aware that you've done with me, but have helped. And it's just interesting to hear how it all works and how much can be done. So I hope that gives lots of people reassurance that they can do a lot more for neurodivergent people, and that for neurodivergent people, there's plenty out there that can support us.
And I think the key message is, if therapy is not working for you, it doesn't mean you're rubbish at it. No. It's just maybe that particular therapy or that particular therapist is not quite in tune with how your brain works, and that's not a judgment either way. It's just that particular that way of working, or that person, or that partnership just isn't right at that point in time.
Well, there'll be something somewhere, so keep going.
Yeah, and a very important point: you're not broken.
No.
It's just a different way of thinking, and that's what we want to get across in the podcast, isn't it? That people are not broken, they're not disordered. It's just the world is really tricky and hard work.
Yeah, it's not getting therapy to go and get fixed and everything you probably feel like you need. It's getting therapy to accept who you are and start learning how that can work better for you, how you can start to look after yourself and do things in the way you want
find
to.
well-being.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. See you next time then.
That is all for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you come back next time. Please follow or subscribe so that you don't miss a thing. And if you'd like even more of us, you can go over to www.maskingforit.com and find more episodes and blogs on our website, which get into some nitty-gritty detail because we do love that. And you can also get in touch with us if there's something that we haven't covered, or you have any questions or something about your experience that you'd like to share, then please send that to us via email. Is contact@maskingforit.com, or any of our socials, which are @maskingforitpodcast. We'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much for being here as we bring the conversation out to the real world to see if we can change it just that little bit. Thank you so much for being a part of it, and we'll see you next time.